why banded hacks? If you've ever wondered that or seen someone put bands on a hack and you're like, why would somebody do that? This video will answer that question fully, because I can't give my full answer for why I like to do it on Instagram. There's a lot of thought process that goes into it, but I'm gonna start with, instead of going super detailed nerd right away, this is the overview of everything I'm gonna cover in the video. So if you wanna stick around for 2 or 3 minutes and then check out, this first part's for you. If you wanna stick around and nerd out a little bit more, I've got the video like I normally do. So first question here, first thing I wanna address is both will work. Both will work really well, and we have all sorts of evidence that you can get ginormous quads doing both. So again, I don't think that you need to do banded hacks. I don't think that either would produce this really dramatically, definitively better difference between one or the other. It's really just a question of efficiency more than anything else, and then a couple other subtle little things. So I say all that because most people, especially the people that argue this type of stuff, the type of hack squat they're doing is most likely bordering on 99.9% of the time not the limiting factor in getting huge quads, right? So this is something where I'm happy to discuss and get all nuanced and get into it, because why not have a deeper understanding if that's interesting to you? But when people kind of confuse having a deeper understanding with let's be emotional about it, create teams, this right or wrong thing or whatever, that's not the purpose of this video. This purpose is a deeper understanding. Most people that really don't have great quads, and that don't have great quads is, whether they're choosing a hack or not choosing a hack, it's more so about a whole bunch of other stuff. Odds are, whatever type of hack they're doing, they're not really controlling the motion, they're not controlling the bottom, they're not being realistic with, how good their form is through the entire range of motion, they're not being realistic with how their form is if they are training close enough to failure, which they might not be doing, or they're not on top of recovery variables. So there's so much more important stuff, which I've done a lot of videos on, aside from this more nuanced stuff that leads to having huge quads. So again, take this all with a grain of salt. Now this is for more advanced people that understand all that. Again, why not pick a version maybe slightly better for you when you can make an argument for? But just realize there's nothing about this video is going to prove anything. There's no evidence out there for sure right now that proves one is definitively better than the other. And that's not the goal of this video either. I'm gonna give you a lot of good logical reasoning. I'm gonna provide you some evidence of why I will choose to program this very often, but I'm still not trying to prove that it's better than the other version. I'm just kind of explaining my thought process and reasoning. Now, like I said too, again, it's not a big deal. That's the funny thing I always want to clarify is if I had a client paying me money and saying, I want huge quads, and I put this in their program and they said, you know what, I prefer, not having bands. And we had like a 2-second conversation of it where maybe I brought up some stuff and they said, no, I really prefer without bands. I'd say, sweet, let's just have that go. So, marinate on that for a little bit. Think about that. That's how big of a difference I really feel it makes. Personal preference from someone that actually knows how to train, knows how to produce results, still outweighs all this logical argument that I can have going here as well too. So I say in here that there's kind of like an inverse relationship with how much someone knows on a subject and how emotional and how loud they are communicating their side. Where again, if you don't really know much, you're gonna hype up the emotion, hype up the volume, maybe make some very entertaining 60-second videos. But the reality is if you have a deeper understanding, you can get into all this nitty-gritty and not be too attached to one side or the other. Again, the only thing that kind of triggers me is people assuming that I don't have what I would call like an infant level knowledge of physics, where it's like, when you put the bands on, it makes the bottom lighter and the bottom's the most important part. I'm like, holy crap, I didn't know that. I've been kind of missing that whole education component of what bands do with weights when you pull on them. So yes, I hate to be a dick, and I'm going to say it at some point in time in this, but as regards to this, I know more than you if you're watching this. And if you do know more than me, hit me up in the comments, because I'll pay you to learn what you know and then eventually know more than you as well too. I pay people a lot of money to learn from them. So I'm going to clarify as we get into all the nitty-gritty, some of the other stuff. This is a big point of confusion, I think. Clarify how important it is to not use certain terms synonymously, talking about the load that's being used for an exercise and joint torque that's occurring at different points in range of motion in the exercise. And this is something that's cool to understand if you're just a trainee, but this is something that educators, if you're an educator, if you're teaching about this, you really want to make sure that you're not mixing up, because I've heard a lot of people kind of mix up those terms, and I think that creates a lot of confusion with this exercise particularly. And then from there, I'm going to discuss, what's some of the evidence that I have for why that I use this specifically. So what I see from a smart person evidence standpoint, if we're looking at some stuff based off of, principles that we hold pretty true in the industry right now, we all agree upon. And then also stuff that I see from actually training lots and lots of people with this and normal hacks, literally for between both of them, 2 decades. But I've been doing banded hacks for probably about 10 years now. So I have a pretty good evidence from actually applying this to people, what you tend to see comparing the two as well too. And then I'm gonna cover some practical stuff as well too. You know, some of the slight difference between setting up the bands, whether you do reverse band or bands from the bottom. I'm gonna talk about basically how you would determine maybe percentage of load versus some other factors determining how many bands, how much load should you have on, and programming considerations, some stuff like that as well too. I'm not gonna get super detailed in how to actually set up the bands. I have another video for that. We'll put a link up here somewhere for that. Trevor's gonna do that. Where basically we're gonna put, again, a video that I did if you have a hack squat or a different hack squat. I have a longer video that really goes into how would you set those up. So let's go. First, we're starting with a quiz. No one told you there was gonna be a quiz, and I've used Dr. Mike here. He was honestly one of the first videos that I found that was a really good front-on video of a lateral raise. And that guy over there, I did banded hacks with at some point in time. He seemed to like him, so there's that. So quiz time. Which one of these overloads the top? So think about that for a minute. We've heard people say this. Which one overloads the top? Write down your answer. It could be just one. It could be both. It could be neither. I don't know. So write down your answer. Don't erase it. And then we're going to have a talk about it. All right? So let's talk about it. Joint torque versus load. So if we are really saying things like load, let's take a look at this one. So we'll go through this. If we're saying things like load, well, what's occurring in these two? This one on the hack squat does technically overload the top, meaning the actual weight that is being applied to Chris's body in this example gets heavier as you go to the top. And the same thing happens whether you band from the top or you band from the bottom. If I literally took a game scale or pushed the scale against, or however you want to measure at the bottom, it might be, again, it's not going to be exact weight because it's not perfectly vertical, but let's say it's going to be 500 pounds here and it's going to be 650 pounds at the top. So the load that's actually being used increases through the range of motion. But that is discussing load. Now, how many people said this one overloads the top and this one overloads the top? Don't lie, you both said it. You both said it overloads the top. Well, if we're speaking load, that's not accurate, because unless you saw some magic voodoo occur during the range of motion here that Dr. Mike went through, I didn't see the weight in his hand change. So if that's 20 pounds or whatever Dr. Mike uses, looks like a 5. So you know this is Mike's top set. Take that, Dr. Mike. But that 5 didn't change. So the load in hand from start to finish stayed exactly the same. So that's why I kind of have a little bit of, well, then what are people talking about when they say overload? Does it really make a difference? Well, it does make a difference, because these do have changing load through the range of motion, but that's not necessarily the loading pattern if we're talking about joint torque or really talking about the profile of an exercise. So if you said with this one, the lateral raise, let's see if I can do this nice and pretty. You said, well, I think it's overloads the top. Well, what you're speaking to is basically the profile of the exercise if we're looking at the loading pattern. And when we're talking about that, really, if we want to talk about it accurately, we're talking about joint torque. So again, not to get too nerd, but your muscles don't manage just load, they manage joint torque. And joint torque is a combination of load and moment arms. And in the equation, they're literally multiplied by each other, so they're of equal importance. And so again, this right here, because this is the same weight, whether it's the bottom or the top, but this is the line of force from that dumbbell, and this is the train joint. This distance here, that little one right there, is the moment arm. So you don't have to know the exact numbers, it doesn't matter, but that's why at the bottom, this feels super duper easy. And as you go up, and let's say we get to the halfway point, and we go here, line of force, same weight. Now this is the new moment arm, right there. The weight stays the same, but why does it feel harder there? Why does it feel like you're overloading the top? Load doesn't change. The moment arm gets longer. If you multiply something bigger where it used to be something smaller, the whole number is going to increase. And then as we come all the way to the top, what do we do here? Same thing. We have the moment arm where it's essentially peaked from that line of force. So if you did the curve of this thing, so let's say we want to graph that, and we're going to start with the concentric. We're going to start, this is the start of the concentric, moving this way. So this is C for concentric. At the bottom, what do we have? Next to nothing. And as we go up through the range of motion, it peaks. So that's when people say, hey, as I go through this, this feels like it overloads the top. Well, the load technically doesn't change, but joint torque changes as you go through the concentric. Why am I going through all this mess? This does not occur here. So when people say this overloads the top the same way this overloads the top, it's just false. Completely inaccurate. No way, shape, or form is that true. So let's dig into that. Since someone's saying, I don't get it, blah, blah, blah. Well, let's clarify. So what's the pattern on this squat? So if we're doing line of force, I'm going to do this all pretty quick, but here's the line of force basically. Why is it at a little bit of a diagonal? You're pushing a little bit up, you're pushing a little bit this way. If we really want to look at what's happening on here, it's not just straight down force. There's also some sliding or friction force on that platform. So it's going to be at a little bit of an angle, not straight up and down. Doesn't really matter, you don't have to know that. But we're looking at quads specifically. Here's the line of force to the quads. So at the bottom of the concentric, again, imagine we've got a load on here. Let's just pretend this isn't banded for a minute. And what happens is we go up through the top, we go about there, and again, the camera moves a little bit here, so shame on the cameraman, but we can see that pretty clearly. They get shorter, and as we come up to the very top, where do we get to? You know, right there, even shorter. So what's the point of doing the hack squat anyway? We'll get into this a little bit more specific, but the whole point of a hack squat, has anyone ever done a hack squat because they're trying to load their quads fully shortened? No, because obviously, as you see, as we come all the way to the top here, the joint's essentially stacked, you know, so there's really, the line of force is right in line with that. So it's not an exercise for overloading the quads fully shortened. No one's ever said it was. Banded or not banded, that's not really the goal of the exercise. So what's the pattern here if we have no bands on here? So we'll do the same little thing here again. We'll draw over Dr. Mike. Make yourself useful, Dr. Mike. Thank you. So what happens as we go through the concentric here? So again, let's say this number stays exactly the same the entire way through the range of motion. So again, if it's, you know, 600 pounds on there is what you're doing, it's 600 pounds the whole way through. But moment arms, remember, this is at the bottom, the start of the concentric, and this is what happens as we come up to the top. So we have kind of the opposite thing happening here. We go from it being very high joint torque to dropping off, if that's what we're going to call the end of the range of motion. So the point of the exercise, I mean, technically it drops off to zero. So what happens if we use bands? So from a practical standpoint, and again, you don't have to quite catch all this, but if we're using the same rep range, you will overall have a little less load in the bottom. So typically if I do reverse bands, let's say, then the load that you're going to handle at the bottom, instead of, if I said 600 pounds, will be 550 pounds. So technically, obviously, the moment arms are going to stay the same no matter what. The only thing we're actually altering at this time is the load. So as we go through the range of motion, joint torque will change, not because moment arm changes, but because loads change. So you'll start at a slightly lower point and then have less of a drop off through the range of motion. Still a gradual curve down. So actually, yeah, hopefully you guys can see. So obviously this first one, if I was really on top of my stuff, I might change colors, but I'm not going to change colors. So this first one has really this kind of drastic drop off through the range of motion. This one has more of a flattened drop off. So this is called, what I would say, flattening the profile of the exercise. So what's the point of this? Let's go on. So first off, I was going to do this the other way around, but let's get to the important stuff. So when people are telling me, you know, but you're overloading the top. I'm not overloading the top. On both of those examples, that was the take home before I erased it, and I know more than you. So I hate to say this because I almost feel like a dick saying this, but this is just such a, you know, when Ron's going through Lowe's or Home Depot, he knows more than the people working there. When I'm talking about hack squats, I know that you've watched TikTok for like 2 years now religiously, and you're very well educated. The people that are commenting, not you guys are smart, but I know more than you. Shut up. So the whole point is so first off, there's two things I want to cover here, which I started to say. One, we don't know that just the lengthened part of the range of motion is more important. There's no definitive evidence on that, and that's for a whole lot of reasons. That'll be a longer video coming soon. If I had to say anything, my personal bias is to think if we're looking at a muscle's full contractile range of motion, from fully lengthened to fully shortened, prioritizing the lengthened to mid-range, so shifting things to those being the exercises you prioritize is the important part. So why would I possibly do that? Why would I actually band it? As we saw with both, so again, here's this again. Here's the whatever. Here's without a band. Here is with a band. Why would I flatten that out? Well, again, this way you're basically doing the exercise just to prioritize and overload the lengthened position. This one you're providing more equal challenge through the lengthened and mid-range. And this is when you hear people called flattening the curve or flattening the profile, which isn't always inherently a good thing, but in this case, I would argue it is a pretty good thing. And so what's the point of this? There's a whole lot of discussion right now around, again, you know, should we train just lengthened or mid-range or whatever? There's not a whole lot of discussion controlling for joint torque there. And I'm going to take the thing that I learned over 10 years ago at this point in time, probably creeping 15 years ago, that's still the best thing that Tom Purvis probably invented 20 years ago, was saying that, yeah, training full range of motion to some capacity is important, but training it through a appropriate load challenge is probably more important. And so if I'm coming back to an exercise and I'm going through a given range of motion, my thought process is, why not challenge what your body is capable of doing at every single point of that range of motion? And so that's the whole point of this. If you don't load it or you don't band it, then the failure point will always be the bottom. People get stuck in the bottom. Nobody gets stuck kind of as they're coming to the top. So that's the main point of that. lightening the profile, and again, for the goal of me not believing that, again, it's just the lengthened part that's important, I think the lengthen through the mid-range is arguably the most important part. So when somebody says, well, you're doing that to overload, you're overloading the top and that's the least important part, in either of these, you're still gonna by far have the most challenged in the length and range. So even if I'm flattening this a little bit, you're still gonna have the most joint torque there, because the moment arms have the biggest impact on joint torque because they're so drastically different from the bottom to the middle to the short, whereas the loading pattern that I'm changing is subtle. So again, for an example here of someone like Chris that has sled weight of, again, obviously it's not exactly true weight what he's using, but I think we had 10 plates on there. So what is that? 450 a side, 900 or something. We're really having the difference, and I've measured this out, we'll cover a little bit, of maybe 100 to 150 pounds different at the bottom. So if he has 900 pounds loaded at the top, we're deloading about 100 to 105. So you're making a subtle difference in this to make a subtle difference in the profile. But either way, the profile is a similar pattern. This one is just more flat. So stop telling me that I'm deloading the top, or that, excuse me, I'm deloading the bottom. I'm not, or overloading the top. I'm just slightly flattening the curve with the idea of being more efficient with the whole range of motion, not just matching what I can as the limiting factor at the bottom, but matching the limiting factor through the entire range of motion. So let's discuss that a little bit more. Could research prove? So again, at some point in time, would we ever do a study that just compares these head on? And could we prove that one is better than the other? I've thought about this a little bit, and this would be such a complicated thing to do, so I just want to put a brief note in here, because there's this idea of we could just compare the two things, and then you'd have to keep all the other variables the same, but how would that translate to actual real-world application? And so if I say we're keeping things the same, we'd say, okay, we're going to have, one group, we have two groups of 12 people, it's just randomly selected or whatever. And one group does this twice a week without the band. The other one does it, twice a week with the band. Has to be set up properly according to me because I'm the one that's interested in the studies. Everything else has to stay the same. So sets stay the same, reps stay the same, proximity to failure stays the same, and all that kind of stuff. And we compare those head to head. So my argument for this exercise is when something is more efficient like this, especially through that range of motion, it's arguably going to be more stimulus. And what happens when you have more stimulus? You have more demands for recovery. And so what do we get? Some of the things we see with this, I'll cover in the next slide, but we see slower rep speed, we see more grinders, we see more challenge through the entire range of motion. So from a practical standpoint, I feel like, and I can't prove this, but this is kind of a simplified term, I can get the same effect from 1 or 2 sets of banded hacks that I could from 2 or 3 or 4 sets of hacks not banded. So what's the issue with that? If we compare these things from head to head, when I'm programming someone with more efficient exercise selection, this is one of the many factors for why I tend to be a little bit more of a lower volume advocate, is because as things become more stimulus, again, more efficient, then also it's more, to recover from and more challenging. So I would argue it can be considered a little bit more of an advanced technique, where not only one would you have to program accordingly, you can't just jump right in and expect the exact same stimulus from the 2 different ones. So in general, if you're going from just without bands to bands properly set up, you would probably want a little bit less volume, and you'd also want recovery to match. So in a study, if we just took kind of some normal people and we put them through this and everything else stayed the same, in theory, we could overtrain the group that had the bands on. In theory, it could just show up that it works better or that it works worse. I don't know. But that's just the thought process when we have a lot of stuff too. And that's a tricky part with some things with research, is when you keep variables the same, well, when we actually look at how some coaches are applying those variables, we're changing things because we have good guesstimates of what's happening when we make those changes. So here's the reasons that I use them. So we have some nerd reasons a little bit, and then also we have some of the stuff that I just witness and see. So one of the biggest things that I notice with this, and I'll kind of hypothesize some reasons. None of this is proven. This is literally just what I observed. So this is the weird thing. I actually train people. I've been doing it literally for almost 20 years. So I apply all this stuff. I don't just talk about it real fast on Instagram or on TikTok in a spliced together 60-second reel to make it sound like I know what I'm talking about. When I've actually applied this to humans, I find some people that were having more sticking points and having a harder time keep progression occurring over time, that this allows them to progress faster. Now, some of that, could that be the novel stimulus that happens whenever you change to any exercise? It's not stuff that I just see just in that beginning phase where, yes, that probably is some of it. I just see that people can keep this movement in longer and progress further. And I would make the hypothesis or argument, if you have a whole range of motion of an exercise, and with one variation, the limiting factor is just this one particular part, whereas opposed to the limiting factor be this entire part, it's more even distribution of the challenge over the range of motion, which I think can make it easier to progress over time. And again, that's my reason I think it is. but it is something that I observe either way, regardless of what I know the reason is. Better failure rep speed. So there seems to be some evidence. Obviously, we know that training to some proximity of failure is important, right? So again, if we stay 10 reps, if we're talking intermediate to advanced people, staying 10 reps short of failure probably isn't going to get it done. You need to train close-ish to failure. Now again, close-ish could be 3 reps in reserve, 2 reps in reserve, 1 rep in reserve, or failure, but we know that things change as we get closer to failure. So regardless of whoever it is, if you stay further away, it's less stimulus. As you go closer, it's more stimulus. And then we can argue the nuance of, where's there a trade-off where it's, too much stimulus for what you're getting from too much to recover from for the stimulus that you're getting, and the fatigue ratio, all that kind of stuff. That's a separate discussion. But one of the things that changes as you get closer to failure is rep speed gets slower. And I used to say that I thought that produced more force. I don't think that's probably actually correct anymore. I'm not really sure what it does, but it seems to be important. We have some research that seems to imply that that's important, regardless if I agree with the mechanism. And then from anecdotal evidence, grinders seem to be important as well too. It could be something just going on chemically we don't completely understand. I don't know. But you definitely get better grinders through the entire range of motion. Lots of times when someone's doing a hack just for the plates, they kind of get stuck and then they just fail. Whereas that's one of the biggest things when people switch to doing this, and it's tricky to coach and do properly, but if people stick with reps, you could have a rep where you're giving 100% effort right from the very bottom, and the whole way through the range of motion, it's the exact same speed. You're giving 100% effort, but you can continue to grind and grind and grind and grind and grind and grind, and you don't have that point where, once you get out of the very bottom, you just kind of pop up to the top. It's a grind, 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 and then continues that grind all the way through. And so again, if failure rep speed is important, which I think it probably is, you absolutely definitively see a better rep speed over the entire range of motion when compared to not using a band. So one of the benefits, this is individual, not necessary for everybody, but you do also have people say that they have knee issues, and very often they have those perceived knee issues at the bottom. So if someone gets acute orthopedic relief, this is for anything in any exercise, so this isn't really something unique to this, but if someone says, hey, I switched to this as opposed to normal and my knees don't hurt, that's always a win. I don't care what it is. The same with another exercise is, oh, when I go from this to chest press to this to chest press, I feel better. We don't need to discuss all the nuance of internal moment arms, and I figure theoretically this one, with actual application, if you make an adjustment and it feels better orthopedically, that's always a better fit. So that's a nice thing that happens sometimes. I could also theoretically make the argument that it's going to have more long-term orthopedic relief or prevent things. And so what's my argument for that? Is when you're going through any range of motion on any exercise, you're going to have joint articulation. So where basically bone and bone kind of come together. We have cartilage there to make that articulation nice and smooth. Over time, we for sure know that wear happens. You can't say for sure why it happens, how it happens. Is it bad patterns? Is it just too much stuff? Whatever. There's a whole lot of factors that I don't want to dumb down and simplify. But over time, as we do a lot of stuff with a lot of force for a lot of volume, you get wear patterns. And as you go through a range of motion, as you go through how your knee works, you're going to have different points making different points on the bones making different contact points through the range of motion. So I would make the argument if one point in time has the most force that's being dealt with through muscles, I would argue that's also where there's going to be the most force being applied in those same spots on those joint articulations. And I would think it would make sense that you could have more wear patterns specific to those points. Whereas if we have a more even distribution of force over the entire range of motion, the entire articulation, maybe it will prevent some of those wear patterns. This is why some people say too, for all other things being the same, it can be good to change your exercises every once in a while. Even if you have 2 squats that are both great, you might as well just rotate, one, every 6 months or so, just to kind of give relief of those wear patterns. And while again, none of this stuff is things that I can prove or feel the need to prove, I think it all makes logical sense, and there's really no downside to it. So even the same argument for changing exercises every 6 months, whether that happens or not happens, it's not really a big deal, whatever. There's no real downside to changing. Again, changing constantly is a bad thing. You wouldn't want to change everything every workout for orthopedic reasons and then not be able to show progressive overload, but that's a different conversation as well too. And then this is purely anecdotal, but they also feel better, specifically banded from the top. And so we'll discuss there's a little difference between banded from the top and the bottom from a physics standpoint, but also a feel standpoint. And when the bands are from the top, they're decelerating you into the bottom, whereas the bands are from the bottom, they're accelerating you from the top. So there is a difference there. So when you are being decelerated into the bottom, that can be great for people and feel better because that is the position that will still be the most joint torque and the most challenge. So if you have something that helps prevent people from dive bombing into that bottom position, overall that's a win and a good thing. And again, perception from an athlete is important as well too. People have kind of taken a dump on feel of anything right now. People say, oh, I feel this one better. And people, experts will be like, what you feel doesn't matter. Whereas like, have you ever trained a client in your entire life? A client tells you, I don't feel the muscle, or I do feel the muscle. They say, I don't feel it. You're like, well, you're an idiot and I'm smarter than you. Let me tell you why that's not important. The nuanced part is obviously feel's not everything. You want to be in great positions and have good exercise selection, have things that most likely make the most sense for a lot of people. But feel absolutely is important, and especially when you actually train human beings and are concerned with their perception of what's going on as well too. It's a factor that should never be just kind of poo-pooed or dismissed. So let's get into some of the practical application. What does this actually look like? So again, from a setup, we'll link the video here again. I don't know if we can link it twice. If we can link it twice and you missed it in the beginning, we'll click it up here again. But there's a video specific to setup, so I'm not going to go a whole lot into how do you do it from the bottom to the top. The biggest thing that you'll take away in those videos is you want a drastic change from top to bottom. So if you go all the way back to the video that I played in the beginning, if you want to do that, or look at any videos that I've done of reverse banding, the big difference is you'll see as you come to the very top of the range of motion, the bands go completely slack. So wherever I have them, that's kind of a trademark, of how you want it to happen. And the point of that is whatever I have on from bands, the end is always 0, right? So that allows me to produce a drastic change. Whereas if the bands are tight from start to finish and I don't always come back to 0, I really can't produce that drastic change. Hopefully, if that makes sense. So if I have the starting point 0, I could make the bottom, I could have the top still be 0, and I could have the bottom be 50 pounds off, 100 pounds off, 200 pounds off, 400 pounds off, and it still comes back to 0. So that's key to having a drastic change from top to bottom, where sometimes I'll see people with like one thin band or whatever, it's tight from start to finish, and depending on how it's set up, it's like, well, you only have like 6 pounds difference from top to bottom. From a percentage standpoint, that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So watch that video if you want some more detail on that. That's the trademark. The biggest thing that you'll see for setup on, and again, this is discussed in that a little bit, but I'll do it here. People always ask percentages. If I had to make up a percentage, I'd probably say somewhere around 20% is the difference you want from top to bottom. So again, if you still haven't figured that out, watch that video again where it's from the bottom, whether you band it from the bottom or from the top, you can have the same amount of difference from the low to the bottom or the top. But the thing I look at the most is failure rep speed. So even if I said, hey, we want 20% difference from top to bottom, so that could be looking like 500 pounds at the top, 400 pounds at the bottom for a number example. Failure rep speed's more important. So once you've practiced these and done these a little bit, what I'm looking for is that grinder from start to finish. Because in a practical application setting when you're actually working in the gym, that is the best way to know, at least if training towards failure is one of our goals, that I have appropriate load challenge through the range of motion. So if you ever go to the point where you're out of the bottom and you kind of spring out of the bottom real fast, and then you run into a wall at the top and you can't finish the rep, that probably means you have too much of a change from top to bottom. Whereas if the other way around happens, then it would argue maybe you need a little bit less banding. So that's kind of the quick way to just look at, okay, well, how would I adjust that? Whereas if, you still have kind of the same thing before where the bottom is just the grinder, and then you pop through the top, that might mean that you need more bands to actually overload that top more or deload the bottom, again, which is all the same thing. So that's a quick way that I would look at that. Programming considerations. So again, I'm going to come back to you can absolutely do both. I don't think one is definitively way better than the other. Again, for some of those reasons, that's the tendency of why I program banded hacks more for all the things I said on the previous slide. So again, if I do have a preference, that is my preference. But if there's something I would actually maybe change for the average person, this wouldn't be for everybody, from what I've probably said in the past till now, the only downside of having the bands from the top consistently is while originally that assists people and not dive bombing into the bottom, you can, from a control standpoint, lose the skill of controlling yourself into the bottom. So again, the way that you can test this is if you ever do them without bands at some point in time, you're going to the bottom and you just kind of feel yourself dropping, where you're just so used to using those bands that you're not actually controlling that bottom position as much as you could on your own. So as a general rule that I literally made up this morning, let's go with an 80-20 rule if you wanted to program, because hey, I buy everything that Joe said here makes sense. That's really good reasoning to do some banded hacks. Maybe I'll give them a shot, put them in my programming for a while. Just as a general rule of thumb, for the average person, I think it's still probably good that 80% of the year you do banded hacks and 20% you take the bands off, if for no other reason than just keeping that skill in there. Now, all that being said, this is still king. I gave that example a bunch of times. With what I would do with clients, personal preference is still king. So like I said, if you're watching all this, and a great reason, like if you're like, man, setting up bands is a pain in the butt, maybe your hack squat at your gym sucks or who knows what, no jokes, that's a great reason to avoid doing something, right? If there's stuff that I hate to do or takes me a long period of time to do, I don't do it either. There's times when I work out in my garage gym at home and do, oh my gosh, exercises that aren't optimal compared to even a video that I've said, because I'd rather conveniently work out in my garage than drive all the way to the gym and have the optimal exercise. So even for, if you're a normal human where adherence is still king, you can make decisions that aren't optimal, and it's okay. Just don't tell your favorite TikToker that's never actually worked with a human being and has no idea that that's a factor with exercise selection and programming. Form considerations. So again, I kind of said it right there, but that's the biggest thing with the form considerations on all of these, is making sure that you're not just losing the skill of controlling the bottom. So it's great that it can slow you down, but especially if you don't load it properly, if you don't use what I recommend, and because you do have people that overload it properly, which I'll discuss in a minute, you don't ever want to lose the ability to control the bottom, because either way, the loading pattern is making the bottom the most challenging and essentially getting less joint torque as you go through the range of motion, and that's how it should be. Because again, like I said in the beginning, I think it makes sense to favor biasing the mid to lengthen range, and either one still biases that, means produces the most joint torque in the lengthened to mid range. One is just much more drastically lengthened, not as much in the mid, and the banded version is obviously a little bit more even challenge from the lengthened through the mid. Both of them do nothing for the shortened position anyway, because it's a squat, and that's what squats are for. One of the things that makes me laugh is when people say, well, we shouldn't do this exercise because a bunch of like 17-year-old kids now are in the gym putting 8,000 bands on a hack just to use more plates. And honestly, if you use that logical thought process, you could literally throw out every single exercise in the gym everywhere, right? Because you can find 17-year-old kids that do dumb stuff to use more weight. Okay, so that's not a realistic thing that here. Does that happen? Of course. Do those same 17-year-old kids put 405 on their back to squat when they could probably only do 135 properly and do this? Yes. Is that a reason that all of us should stop doing squats and say that squats are stupid because we're pointing at 17-year-olds to do them wrong? Hopefully normal people see the logical fallacy with that. But yeah, so I had to put that in there because people put that in there. And then last thing here, isn't it neat that I put so much thought process into my exercise selection? Isn't it neat? Wouldn't it be cool if there was some way that you could follow programming from someone who puts that much thought process into their exercise selection, all their programming, all their workouts, and all the guidance they provide? Good news, you can. If you click the link down below, I have an app that has all of my programs, has a whole lot of educational videos, has a full exercise library, has forums where you can ask me directly questions and my other coaches questions and learn all this stuff. So you know that you have myself and a team that, again, didn't just learn stuff from watching TikTok for a couple years and has 90-second sound bites. If you have a want or need a deeper understanding and confidence in what you're doing behind it, that's what I'm there for. That's what my app is there for. That's a pretty good plug, right? That felt natural. You guys didn't see that coming at all unless you read ahead. But anyway, so that, for everyone that asks, why would you do banded hacks, Joe? Don't you know that the bottom's the most important? You're overloading the top? Shut up. Watch the video again. I know what I'm doing. I know about things. I know about muscles. Ask me about anything else, even things related to muscles. Physiology, don't know as much. Chemistry, bad at that. Got bad grades in school. Mechanics, I know a little bit about that, and I'll continue to pay to know more about that. So if you guys have any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, get down in the comment section, get rowdy, do the YouTube thing if you haven't already. Like, share, subscribe. Send this video to anybody that bans or doesn't ban hacks, and still send them to your mom. I appreciate a lot of you guys have been sending my videos to your moms. Your moms are getting swole. I think when you're watching this, Mother's Day is coming up. Send it to mom for Mother's Day. And if you're watching this sometimes past when I'm actually posting this, send it to her anyway, because every day mom needs to get huge. As always, appreciate you guys, and leave me stuff down below.